The fighter sat on the tarmac like a creature out of place, sleek, predatory, and gleaming in fresh camouflage. American ground crews walked around it with a mixture of pride and confusion. Pride because the machine was powerful. Confusion because almost nobody in the U.S. Army Air Forces actually wanted to fly the thing. This was the Bell P-63 Kingcobra plane built in America, tested in America, paid for by America. But destined to fight and die under a foreign flag, most American pilots dismissed it before ever touching the stick. But thousands of miles away, Soviet engineers stared at the exact same aircraft with a completely different reaction. For them, the Kingcobra was not a rejected prototype. It was a godsend. A weapon they believed could shift battles, protect tank columns, and punch through German armor with terrifying force. So how did an aircraft the Americans cast aside become one of the deadliest and most feared low-altitude fighters on the Eastern Front? Why did Soviet squadrons request it by name? Why did German pilots mention it in their combat reports with frustration and, in some cases, fear? And why is this aircraft still shrouded in mystery today? This is the story of the fighter that America designed, but the Soviets perfected. The plane the U.S. dismissed. But the Red Air Force used to hunt, strike, ram, and dominate. This is the untold rise of the P-63 Kingcobra. The war had changed faster than American aircraft designers could keep up. By 1943, the U.S. was obsessed with long-range escort missions over Europe. Everyone wanted Mustangs. Everyone wanted Thunderbolts. And by then, the Air Forces were finally getting both in massive numbers. So when Bell Aircraft unveiled a refined successor to the P-39, Kingcobra, the P-63 reaction inside the Pentagon was lukewarm. Not because it was bad, but because it didn't fit the new vision of air combat. It wasn't built for high-altitude dogfights. It wasn't a long-range escort. It wasn't a strategic bomber killer. It was something else entirely, a low-altitude, close-range, fast-climbing, heavily armed brawler, designed for the kind of brutal frontline fighting American strategists cared less about. But the Soviet Union? They practically lived at low altitude. Their pilots fought over forests, trenches, tank lines, towns, rivers, rarely climbing above 4,000 meters. They didn't need strategic fighters. They needed street fighters. And that is exactly what Bell had delivered. Soviet test pilots noticed the difference immediately, during trials. The P-63 impressed them so much that the test director, Vasily Stepanyan, reportedly called it the aircraft we asked for. Finally delivered. Where the Americans saw a mismatch, the Soviets saw a masterpiece: excellent visibility, fast acceleration at low level, an engine that performed better, the lower U-flue blistering roll rate, armor protection superior to most Soviet fighters, and the crown jewel, the 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. It wasn't just a fighter. It was a flying anti-tank gun. The Soviets immediately made a request. Send every Kingcobra you can build, and America agreed quietly. The Kingcobra became a Lend-Lease weapon, one that would ultimately be sent to the USSR in enormous numbers. But from here, the story gets stranger. Because what the Soviets did with the aircraft wasn't just unexpected, it was revolutionary. German aircraft like the Bf-109G and Fw-190A performed best at high altitude. But the Eastern Front wasn't fought up there. It was fought just above the tree line, and that was Kingcobra territory. Soviet pilots found they could pull insane low-level turns, dive at terrifying angles, and fire pinpoint cannon shots with frightening precision. The P-63 didn't just match German aircraft at low altitude. In many dogfights it outturned, outclimbed, and outgunned them, the Germans noticed. Late-war Luftwaffe intelligence reports describe unusual American aircraft with powerful nose cannon, high maneuverability below 4,000 meters. Effective in ground attack and pursuit roles, the Kingcobra was becoming a problem, but the Soviets weren't finished. The Red Air Force made a long list of improvements, many never officially documented in American records. Retuned engine settings for colder climates, modified fuel systems, adjusted weapons mounts for better recoil control, strengthened certain components for rough Soviet airfields field-installed armor and some units fine-tuned gun harmonization for ground attack. American mechanics would never have approved some of these changes. But Soviet frontline crews weren't concerned with perfect engineering. They wanted results. And they got them. The aircraft that arrived in Soviet service was not the same aircraft that left American factories. It was faster, meaner, tougher, and tailored for the brutal realities of the Eastern Front. Here's where the story takes a sharp and controversial turn, one that historians still debate, veterans still whisper about, and governments once tried very hard to bury beneath official statements and diplomatic silence, according to Washington's official narrative during World War II. The Bell P-63 Kingcobra was never used in combat by any nation receiving it under Lend-Lease. The aircraft, they insisted, was strictly for training. Nothing more. Nothing less. The P-63, they said, never fired a shot in anger on behalf of the United States or its allies, but that was just the official story, behind closed doors, and especially behind the fog of the Eastern Front. The truth was far more complicated, far more explosive, because while America stamped training use only on paperwork, the Soviet Union was doing something entirely different with the sleek, fast, heavily armed Kingcobra. They were taking it into battle from the moment the first P-63s arrived in Soviet hands, shipped in pieces across the Pacific, reassembled by factory crews and ferried to operational units. Frontline commanders recognized its potential. The aircraft was rugged, well-built, and uniquely suited to the brutal air combat conditions of the Eastern Front. It had excellent low-altitude performance, a powerful 37mm cannon, and strong armor protection around the cockpit. The Soviets quickly discovered that, for certain missions, nothing else in their inventory could match it. Unofficially, the Kingcobra began appearing in multiple frontline roles, including low-altitude interceptor against German reconnaissance aircraft, quick-strike fighter bombers, and low-level intruders. The P-63's agility and firepower made it a formidable threat. Ground attack fighter, its heavy cannon and durable airframe made it ideal for smashing German convoys. Artillery positions and armored columns, armed escort for Il-2 Sturmovix, the legendary flying tanks of the Red Army Air Force, were devastating but vulnerable without protection. Kingcobras often escorted them through heavy flak and sudden fighter attacks, anti-tank strike platform. The 37mm cannon, originally designed for armored targets, proved capable of destroying lightly armored vehicles and even damaging heavier German tanks when fired from above or the rear. Bomber hunter German Heinkels, Junkers, and Dorniers hated it. One accurate burst from the Kingcobra could shred a bomber. Air superiority fighter during late war offensives during the Soviet drive toward East Prussia and Berlin. The Kingcobra was used to gain and hold air dominance at low and medium altitudes. Some Soviet squadrons even went much further. They used the P-63 in Terran attacks. The terrifying tactic of intentionally ramming an enemy aircraft with the wing, fuselage, or even the propeller to bring it down. The Kingcobra's rugged structure made it one of the few Western-built planes capable of surviving such impacts. Pilots trained for it. A few even lived through it. And yes, this part is still debated, denied, and argued over. Several Soviet aces are believed to have scored confirmed victories with the P-63, but these records were often suppressed by Soviet authorities, lost in chaotic wartime archives, misfiled intentionally to avoid political questions, never reported to American officials. Why hide it? Because Lend-Lease agreements forbade frontline use. Because Washington didn't want the diplomatic headache. Because Moscow didn't want Washington to stop shipping aircraft. So the truth stayed buried, both governments choosing silence over scandal. In reality, the truth was simple. If a Soviet frontline unit needed firepower, endurance, and rugged reliability, they asked for Kingcobras, and when they got them, they flew them hard, fought with them fiercely, and trusted them in missions where survival depended on power, toughness, and a weapon that could tear apart steel and concrete. The P-63 wasn't a training aircraft. Not on the Eastern Front, not in the hands of pilots fighting for Survival. Not in the skies, where truth and myth blended into a single, deadly reality. The Kingcobras fought, and the men who flew them never forgot it. When the guns fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the Soviet Union did not pause to celebrate. The Red Army, battered but victorious, immediately shifted its gaze toward the east toward the unfinished war against Imperial Japan. For years, Stalin had promised the Allies he would join the fight once Hitler was defeated. Now, with Germany in ruins, that promise came due. The targets were vast and formidable: Manchuria, the Japanese Empire's industrial stronghold; Sakhalin, the strategic northern island guarding approaches to the Pacific; the Kuril Islands, a chain stretching like a jagged spine toward Japan's northern shores. In August 1945, the Soviets launched a series of lightning operations, fast, brutal, and devastatingly effective. Massive armored columns swept across Manchuria's plains. Naval infantry stormed beaches under heavy fire. Air units scrambled to control skies that had been quiet for years. And in the midst of this enormous undertaking, one aircraft played a role largely hidden from Western records: the Bell P-63 Kingcobra. Though officially labeled a non-combat Lend-Lease aircraft, the P-63 once again slipped into the shadows of policy and into the realities of warfare. Soviet commanders had no intention of leaving such a capable machine sitting idle while their armies surged across Asia during the Manchurian strategic offensive, the largest land operation of the final days of World War. Two P-63s were deployed extensively. Their missions were varied, demanding, and crucial to the Soviet advance, providing air cover for rapidly moving armored spearheads. Soviet tanks drove deep into Manchuria at unprecedented speed, often outrunning their own fighter units. The Kingcobras, with their impressive range and rugged low-altitude performance, became the ideal guardians of these armored thrusts. They protected columns from Japanese air attacks and scouted ahead for ambush. Hunting Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, Japanese Ki-46, Dyna, and Ki-15 reconnaissance planes attempted to shadow Soviet troop movements. The P-63s, fast and heavily armed, were ordered to intercept and destroy them before they could report back. Several were shot down in the opening days of the campaign, blinding Japanese commanders. Attacking fortified positions, the Kingcobra's 37mm cannon, designed originally for anti-armor roles, proved devastating against bunkers, pillboxes, and entrenched Japanese troops. Ground units frequently called in P-63s to smash strongpoints blocking their advance, escorting bombers on deep penetration strikes as Soviet bombers hit rail lines, depots, airfields, and command centers. P-63s flew close escort. Their presence discouraged Japanese fighters from engaging, and their accuracy at low altitude made them valuable in suppressing anti-aircraft fire. For many Soviet air units operating in the Far East, the P-63 was the first American aircraft they had ever received in such quantity. The Kingcobra's arrival transformed several regiments overnight, giving them more firepower and survivability than they had ever possessed in the region. For Japanese forces, the appearance of these unfamiliar American-built fighters was unsettling, and, in many cases, the last thing they ever saw. The Kingcobras dominated skies where Japanese air power had thinned to a shadow of its former strength. And in those final days of the war, as Soviet armies surged through the last strongholds of the Japanese Empire, the P-63 quietly wrote its own chapter, one rarely acknowledged in Western histories, yet remembered vividly by the men who flew them. In the Far East, the Kingcobra was not a footnote. It was a weapon of victory. When the Second World War ended, the vast fleets of aircraft that had carried nations to victory suddenly became relics of a bygone era. Factories that once turned out fighters by the thousands shut down their lines. Airfields became graveyards of aluminum and steel. The Bell P-63 Kingcobra, one of the most controversial, misunderstood, and secretly influential aircraft of the war, was no exception. Most Kingcobras met their end quickly. Some were scrapped within months, chopped down and melted into raw metal to feed peacetime industries. Others were relegated to training roles, their combat careers officially unacknowledged, their wartime achievements quietly erased from Western records. A few were stored away, sitting in hangars and depots until their parts were stripped or their frames sold as surplus on paper. The P-63's story should have ended there, an overlooked aircraft with modest production numbers, overshadowed by the legendary P-51 Mustang, the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt, and the elite late-war Spitfires. In most American history books, the Kingcobra barely receives more than a sentence or two. It is frequently dismissed as a training aircraft, a footnote in a war dominated by more famous machines, but history is rarely as simple as official. Records make it appear, because while the West forgot the Kingcobra, the Soviets never did. The Red Army Air Force had flown the P-63 in numbers no other Allied power ever approached. Nearly 2,400 Kingcobras, almost the entire production run, went to the USSR. Soviet pilots learned the aircraft inside and out. Mechanics stripped it down and rebuilt it. Engineers studied its strengths and weaknesses. Divisional commanders analyzed its performance under the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front and the Far East campaigns. What they learned would quietly shape the next generation of Soviet aviation. Many features that became trademarks of post-war Soviet fighter design can be traced directly to operational experience with the P-63. High firepower Soviet doctrine had always favored heavy armament, but the Kingcobra's nose-mounted 37mm cannon and the stability with which the aircraft delivered it reinforced this belief. Later fighters such as the MiG-15 and MiG-17 would continue the tradition of high-caliber weapons capable of crippling an enemy with a short burst. Superior cockpit visibility. The P-63's bubble canopy offered exceptional visibility compared to many Soviet fighters of the time. Pilots who flew Kingcobras noticed the immediate tactical advantage of all-around vision. This influenced canopy design in several post-war Soviet aircraft, which prioritized wide viewing angles for dogfighting and ground attack. Rugged airframes built for harsh conditions, the Kingcobra could withstand rough landings, extreme cold, and damage that would have downed more delicate fighters. Soviet engineers took note. Durability, already a valued Soviet design trait, was pushed even further in the post-war era, producing jet fighters and interceptors capable of operating from primitive airfields and enduring harsh climates. Optimized low-altitude performance, while Western doctrine focused increasingly on high-altitude, long-range escort missions. Soviet combat remained dominated by close air support, interception, and low-level engagements. The P-63 excelled in this environment. Its performance at low and medium altitudes validated Soviet tactical thinking and shaped the design parameters for early Cold War fighters. In a way, the Americans built the Kingcobra, but the Soviets taught the world what it could do. Yet perhaps the most remarkable part of the P-63's legacy is how quietly it has lived on. The aircraft does not enjoy the fame of the Spitfire, the P-51, or the Zero. It rarely appears in documentaries, and its combat record is still clouded by decades of diplomatic silence. Official U.S. histories continued for years to insist that the P-63 saw no wartime combat at all. But on the Eastern Front, Soviet pilots knew better. In the Far East, Japanese troops saw the truth firsthand, sometimes in the final seconds before a 37mm round tore through their tank or fortification. In Manchuria, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands, the Kingcobra became a symbol of firepower and speed. And for Soviet engineers and tacticians, it became something even more important. A blueprint. It influenced how future aircraft would be armed, how they would be flown, and how they would be designed to withstand the unforgiving realities of warfare. Its DNA lived on not in American aviation, but in the aircraft of the nation that tested it under fire long after the West believed it was sitting quietly in training units. In Western books, the P-63 often remains a mere footnote, overshadowed by the glamour of the Mustang, the ruggedness of the Thunderbolt, and the fame of the Spitfire. But on the Eastern Front, in the hands of Soviet pilots who flew it against German armor, Japanese positions, and reconnaissance aircraft fleeing for altitude, the Kingcobra earned Something far more lasting than fame. It earned respect, respect not recorded in official histories, not celebrated in Hollywood, and not commemorated in museums, but remembered by the men who trusted their lives to it. And in the end, perhaps that is the truest measure of an aircraft's legacy. The Kingcobra story isn't about an aircraft that failed. It's about an aircraft that found the right pilots at the right moment in the most brutal war in human history. It's a reminder that sometimes the machines we overlook become the machines that change everything. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the forgotten weapons of World War II, make sure you hit subscribe and join us here on WW2 Rewind, where we bring lost history back to life one story at a time, because the past isn't just something we study, it's something we relive. And the next forgotten chapter is already waiting.